Welcome to Aging Wisely, the podcast, a show that aims to center the lives and needs of the aging and disabled communities, a platform for the issues that matter to them most, a space for them and those who work with and alongside them. I am Veronica Escobar, the producer and host. My goal is to educate and transform. Maria McGinley is a special education attorney and partner at Mayerson and Associates, which is a boutique special education law firm in New York. Before becoming an attorney, she was a special education teacher in New York City. She was inspired to become an attorney due to her time in the classroom. She told me that she kind of fell into teaching while tutoring as an undergraduate at NYU. It worked for her at the time, but was not her long-term goal. So during the time that you were teaching, what were the best things about the job?
By far, the best thing about the job is the students. And that goes across the board in pretty much any class setting I've ever taught in. Being able to see the impact of working with a child day in and day out really is enormous. And the ability to create a rapport with students and assist them in some of their most vulnerable areas is really not only challenging, which is great for your own self-growth, but is also extremely rewarding.
On the flip side, what was the most challenging aspect of working not only as a teacher, but working in the special education area?
One of the challenges I faced was the size of the bureaucracy within New York City specifically, and just the way in which it was set up. There were so many different layers for some of the simplest things. One of the other challenges is when you're looking at students who have IEPs or students who have disabilities, you need to ensure that you're individualizing educational programs for them. And when you have students in the same class who present with disparate and sometimes grossly disparate needs, that becomes mathematically challenging in that you're one special education teacher with one paraprofessional oftentimes and multiple students who present with varying needs across the board.
Do you think that that challenge, which, to an outsider like me sounds massive and complicated, is what ultimately influenced you to go into law? What was it about being in the classroom where you said, this isn't for me, but that is?
I worked alongside some amazing professionals. And even when I looked at the best teachers or the best therapists, the best of the best, it still was impossible to truly individualize programs for students. And so you realize, or at least I realized, that you get to a point where even if you do your best isn't enough. Your best doesn't cut it. And that just wasn't okay for me. I wasn't comfortable with living with that. And I wanted my best to be meaningful and to make an actual difference. And I felt as though I was better situated in advocating for some of these students in a different capacity.
Earlier on in her own education, Maria had thought about becoming an attorney and even took some pre-law classes. But it was only when she entered the classroom as a special education teacher that the idea of marrying law and special education crystallized for her. Obviously, as a teacher, you had parent-teacher conferences and you talked to parents throughout the year. What did you learn about children with disabilities by interacting with their parents?
I learned that being a parent of a special education child is one of the most challenging things that a human can probably do.
But there was a word that you used in the beginning of the interview, and the word was bureaucracy. That one of the things that struck you was the multiple levels of bureaucracy that are involved in special education. As a lawyer, what is your perspective now on that bureaucracy?
The nature of the bureaucracy impedes on not only the efficiency and the speed with which other easily resolvable situations can be resolved, but it also just creates many more layers that, particularly for families that are pro se and unrepresented, become a tremendous impediment, if not an entire roadblock, to those families seeking true justice and the help that they need to support their children.
The difference between the people who have the means to retain lawyers and fight and those that don't. In what ways are they treated the same, and in what ways are they treated differently?
All families can have a very challenging time with the IEP process, especially when it's your first IEP season. When families do have resources, and by that I don't just mean money, families who are in the know, they have an advantage in the ability to secure perhaps private services or private evaluations that can help either serve as leverage when trying to show a school district what their child needs, or to set themselves up in a position where they can be successful at a due process proceeding should they need to utilize that avenue for their recourse.
Let's say, for example, a family knows that their child is being born with a disability. What can a family do when a child is a baby or very young to prepare themselves for the special education setting?
All of the research over the past number of decades has been pretty crystal clear on the fact that the earlier the intervention, the better possibility for the outcome. While it is extremely challenging for families with very, very young children, I would certainly recommend those families to learn about the early intervention process. Early intervention is key. The IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, has a whole section within it that talks about the rights and entitlements for children who are age 0 to 36 months. Those services can be, where appropriate, provided to children and their families to try to, at a very early on point, address some of the areas of delay and remediate them to the best they possibly can.
How does a parent address the ever evolving educational needs of a child who has a disability? Children don't necessarily remain static throughout their entire development, they change. And so do children with disabilities. How does a parent even begin to address those changes? And I know that IEPs have a role in this. And for many parents who have children with disabilities, an IEP is the bane of their existence. So, explain the IEP process and why it's yearly, or maybe even more frequently than that.
IEPs are required to be conducted yearly. They may certainly happen more frequently, especially if a parent makes a request. Another very important part of the IEP process are evaluations and assessments. School districts bear the burden of evaluating and assessing children with suspected disabilities. Those evaluations and assessments are going to provide not only standardized tools, if appropriate, but also observations, oftentimes recommendations. They are going to take into consideration the totality of information that they have about the child and start to form the basis of what should be a discussion at an IEP meeting. The better IEP meetings are ones where the entire team, meaning every person at the table, most especially the parent, should be able to have enough information in front of them so that you can really get a full sense of who the child is, where they perhaps used to be when they were last evaluated, how far along they've moved, what progress have they made. If they haven't made progress, that most certainly is going to be at the forefront of, hopefully, a discussion at the IEP meeting.
Where does a parent even start? If they think that their child has a developmental issue or a learning disability, or they know that something isn't right,
A parent should contact their school district's Committee on Special Education or substantial equivalent and request an evaluation for their child. That evaluation process should be the start of the school district not only evaluating the child, but determining whether or not the child is eligible for special education services and thus eligible for an IEP.
So the IEP meeting, as succinctly as is possible, what's it like?
So the IEP meeting for a first-time parent can be extremely overwhelming. It can be overwhelming for parents who have gone through multiple IEP meetings. Every IEP meeting can be a little bit different. I have attended IEP meetings with families where it's one or two people from the school district and the parent and myself. There are parents who have gone to IEP meetings and there are 15 or more individuals from the school district sitting in a room with them. Now, imagine you're the parent of two children. Your oldest is 6 years old, and you're having an IEP meeting about your 6-year-old. If you're walking into a room of 15 people with a whole lot of letters after their name, and they all work for the same school district and they all work together, that can be extremely overwhelming. Parents can feel rushed sometimes. Parents can feel as though they're just a parent. They don't have expertise or background in education or special education. The IEP itself is supposed to be a blueprint for a child's entire educational program. It's an intensive document. It's looking at the student's present levels of performance. It's looking at where the student has been. It's looking at diagnoses and classifications, the modifications that are needed for the student to be successful in the class, what goals and objectives need to be worked on. Is a plethora of information that a parent might not consider or think about in advance of going into the IEP meeting. It can be extremely overwhelming.
Now, you just touched upon something, and it's the litigation. Walk us through, as best as you can, the different types of legal remedies that exist within special education for families and their children.
There are a number of remedies that exist for children with special needs, depending on what the issues are, the specific law that you're going to file a case under, what relief you're seeking. When I use the terms filing for due process, I'm specifically referring to the IDEA, where the family feels as though their child has not been afforded a free, appropriate public education, and they are seeking other relief. There are children and young adults who reach a point in time where their needs require more than just a school day program. They need to be in a residential program. There are students who need compensatory education. For students who should have been evaluated or receiving special education services all along and weren't. Some families feel the need to file for due process to try to get a bank of hours or other relief that will put their child in the position that their child otherwise would have been in, but for the failure of the school district in providing them a free, appropriate public education.
I want to talk a little bit about why attorneys like yourselves are so important. Speaking as a lawyer, we can clear the path sometimes. We guide people through very rough waters or emotional situations. What does a lawyer like you add to this journey?
Lawyers who practice in this field day in and day out are familiar with the process, the players, the trends, and the ebbs and flows. There are some times where school districts are more amenable to settling certain cases. There are some seasons where litigation is rampant. And so having an expert litigator who is quarterbacking your due process proceeding can be extremely meaningful to the ultimate outcome of your case. Special education attorneys, oftentimes, like our office, are constantly brainstorming and seeing the forest for the trees and not looking at one specific case or one child. And while we most certainly care about our clients, we're looking through a lens that's going to be different than a parent representing their own child, and really see where, from a legal and a litigation perspective, any weaknesses in our case exist, where the strengths are, what the strategy should be. And I think that can give clients a large advantage in some instances when having to navigate the due process proceeding.
You talked a little bit about knowing the players. And I know that as an attorney, when I go into a courtroom, I have familiarity with the judge. I know the judge's court attorney. Oftentimes, I know the attorneys on the other side because there's a saying, or at least it's my saying, the legal community is really small. There are a lot of lawyers, but it's small. And so when you're looking at different practice areas, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. How important is knowing the players and knowing your colleagues in helping clients navigate this?
I think knowing the players is extremely important. Working in an office such as ours, where we have access to multiple other attorneys to brainstorm, but outside of just our office, I think it's extremely important to know the players. You're right. There are a lot of lawyers, but the legal field is small. The special education legal field is very small. When we look at other parents' attorneys, I think it is extremely helpful to know what challenges they're facing, questions or concerns they have within the field. It helps us get a better sense of what the real temperature of the water is. And then with respect to our adversaries, and a lot of times there aren't adversarial relations, it's really important to have a strong and a positive relationship because they are going to help you navigate through the weeds to the extent that they're able to really help you get through that process.
I'll use the word. Is it a collaborative effort sometimes? Can it be?
I will say that some of my cases have been an extremely collaborative effort, not only in New York City, but in other school districts as well. There are certain cases where various individuals from the school district will acknowledge this is a case that we should resolve. And while that resolution may take far longer than I would like, or the family, more importantly, might like, resolution can be achieved. There are other instances where quite the opposite has been the case. That's extremely challenging for everyone involved.
How big of a component do you think economics is in the decision of any school district to do anything? Because I tend to think, as an outsider who has some tangential experience with special ed, that money definitely plays a factor. Like, how much is X going to cost us versus Y? And that if you're representing a school district, you are there to represent their interests, and that those interests are sometimes tied to dollars and cents.
I think economics certainly plays a factor. The extent to which it plays a factor can depend, I think, on the size of the school district and perhaps a few other factors. For example, you may have a smaller school district that has their own counsel who is, working on all of their matters and representing that school district not only in the due process context but in the overall school district. I think that opinion is going to go a long way regardless of the economic structure of that district's budget. But that also depends on who the school district's attorney is. In New York City, I think it's very uncommon for DOE attorneys to have that kind of power without any supervisory component that a matter should in and of itself be settled for X number of dollars, etc. You also need to take into consideration that all of the New York City cases need to be improved by the New York City comptroller. And so that's another barrier that can present itself when you're trying to timely resolve an issue.
I want to backtrack a little bit because we started talking about the IEP process and how difficult it is for newbie parents and even for parents who have been through the cycle. How do things change as a child with a disability enters adolescence? Because once you're in adolescence, you're a hop, skip, and a jump away from adulthood. So I wanted to talk about, and this is my question, how long can a child remain within the special education system? Because the rules are different for special education as opposed to a child who's mainstream.
So the IDEA provides and affords protection to students until they are 21 years old, unless they have graduated. Every May or June, we get at least a few phone calls to our office by parents saying, my school district is trying to graduate my child, and my child really wants to accept his or her diploma, but my child isn't ready to graduate. My child needs another year, but because my child meets the bare minimum requirements, the school district is trying to graduate my child. Under those circumstances, once a child has graduated and has received a diploma, he or she is no longer eligible for any services under IDEA. That being said, children who continue to require special education services are entitled to do so until they are 21 years old.
So does that mean that they remain in a high school setting, or is there something after high school?
The programming that may take place for a student who is between the ages of 18 and 21 can look different depending on that individual student. There are some school programs that will go until 21. There are many other kinds of programs that exist that can include vocational elements. I think it's really important to impress upon parents and families the concept of transition planning. The IDEA makes it very clear that for students who are of a certain age, and that age varies state to state, they not only need to be assessed for transition related topics, but those assessments of themselves, their parents, and an educator or a teacher or a therapist, those assessments need to form the basis of what becomes a transition plan in that child's IEP.
So can you talk about what a transition plan is?
A transition plan is designed to look at all aspects of a child's needs currently and the child's desires and motivations and interests going forward to help a child be as successful and as independent as possible when they graduate or otherwise age out of the school based system. A transition plan can look at a wide array of things. You are certainly looking at academics if that's appropriate. If you're looking at a student who is going to go to college, wants to go to college, wants to enter a post secondary educational program, what does the student need now that they are in high school or of the transition age to get to that point, to be as successful as they can be? There are other students who may have certain career goals in mind, what those career goals may be, how realistic those career goals may be, and what that career path looks like for that student. What skills do they need now and over the course of this transition plan to be as successful as they can be to try to enter into that career eventually?
How far in advance should a parent start thinking about transition planning?
I would say realistically that it's never really too early to start thinking about it. But the worst predicament a family can be in is having a child who's about ready to walk across the stage and receive a diploma, or who is about to age out of a school based program that has not properly set up that child to be as successful and independent as they can possibly be. If I were in the parent's shoes, I am most certainly sitting down saying to myself, I want to be thinking about this as early on as possible to ensure that the classes, the activities my child is taking are consistent with what he or she needs to get to where he or she needs to be.
Parents know their children. They know what their children's strengths and weaknesses are. And if the child is in a position to advance in their education, if their disability is the type that it doesn't preclude them from higher education, you are correct. I think the more prepared you are, the more proactive you can be. There's nothing worse than being in a position of reactivity where you're left scrambling and you have to take what's left.
And I also think that that can be true of students who may ultimately fall into a residential type situation. No parent ever wants to think about sending their child to a residential program. But we have worked with a number of families who have had serious concerns about their children's behavior, their children's safety. It is really important to try to start thinking about it, even if it's a thought process, to try to start thinking about what that process might be like. Because as you said earlier, the last place you want to be is stuck with what you're stuck with.
How do you as an attorney, because I can imagine that there is a certain element of hand-holding and also telling it like it is. Like, there's a delicate balance when you're advocating for families. You have to, demonstrate a measure of empathy and understanding, as well as overwhelming patience, not only with the people that you're trying to advocate for, but the fact that you're dealing with a bureaucracy that's never ending. How do you manage that? How do you manage towing the line between holding their hand when they need it and telling them how it is when you have to?
I think that remaining child focused, student focused is the easiest way to navigate the handholding that every family deserves through this process, with also being very real and open and honest and transparent with the families. The reality is, if I'm not going to be real and open and honest and transparent with you, there's going to come a point in time where you're going to be very displeased with me. And I don't want to be in that situation. I don't want a family to be in that situation. So my rule is always is always transparency across the board. At the same point in time, clients are coming to us when they are in extremis. They have a child with special needs, and what's happening is presenting a very large problem for their child and their family. They can't be in a worse educational dynamic than when they're crossing the threshold of our office.
They're on the precipice. I'm about to fall over.
Exactly. And so it's not only a matter of walking them through that and talking them through that, but also letting them know this is a long journey. And I'm constantly saying, I just want to manage your expectations. You need to know what you're getting into, more about the process, obviously, and what your rights and entitlements are. It's knowing what the big picture is. And that can be extremely overwhelming. So, obviously, you're presenting that in a way that's amenable to parents really hearing you and being open to having that kind of discussion, but also letting them know, like, we're in this together. We are partners together, and together is the only way that we're gonna get through to the other side.
If a family or a parent or a guardian is listening to you right now and they find themselves questioning their child's ability, they may suspect that their child has a disability, or maybe they're going through it. They're going through their own battle with their education system. What's one piece of advice or the best piece of advice that you can give them?
The first piece of advice I would give them is to trust your gut. As a parent, as a guardian, as a loved one for an individual who may have special needs or who may be in some kind of educational crisis, if you think that something is wrong, it's very likely that something is wrong. But I think coupled with that piece of advice, you also need to be very cognizant that not only do you not know what you don't know, but you are a parent or a guardian or a loved one. And it will be very helpful for you to seek the help of someone who is a third party, preferably with an area of expertise, who will be able to help guide you and your child through perhaps an evaluation or trying to figure out what are the actual issues that exist here, what areas need to be evaluated or assessed further, and and what roadmap can be created even in the short term for us to advance this along so that way we could be making meaningful changes for this child.
Being in the trenches for 11 years as an attorney and another 4 as an educator, If you could wave a magic wand, and obviously you and I know that, well, we can't, but if you had the power to change something about the educational system for children with disabilities, what is the one thing that you would change?
That's a great question. It's a very hard question. So, one of the things I think in an ideal world, if money and everything else were no object, would be to create more public school options for students so that there could be less litigation.
I sometimes will ask a guest if it's appropriate, if they can think back to a client that they worked with, a person that they met where they walked away feeling positive. Is there any client that you've ever had that left an imprint on you, and why? Maria then proceeded to tell me the story of a client she represented before she was even admitted to practice law. The child had a host of serious behavioral issues, including tantrums and being nonverbal. His public school readily admitted that he was not in the right placement, so they helped so that he could be placed in a private school. Maria's firm continued to work with the family, and a few years later, the mom invited her to dinner, and she saw the child again. Things were definitely different.
I saw the client mom and her family, and I saw the student, and his eyes lit up like as soon as he saw me. And I said to him, without even thinking that, he was nonverbal, I said to him, "Do you remember me?" And he responded, "Yes." And we had a whole meal together. And throughout the meal, he was enjoying, not only able to, but enjoying sitting at a table, ordering his own meal, eating his own meal. And then right before, it sounds like it's coming out of a storybook, but this is legitimately a true story. Right before the meal was over and right before we were about to get up, there were fireworks that were taking place over New York City that we could see from where we were. And he grabbed my hand and he gently pulled me out of my seat and walked me over to the water side. And he pointed to all the fireworks and he named every single firework by their color: red, yellow, blue. And when it was all done, he said, "Beautiful." And I remember thinking to myself, this was a child who not only didn't have the skills that he needed to be able to express himself and express his feelings and his emotions, but who, if not for some level of intervention, would have remained in that program. Where would he be today if he weren't in this private school program?
And I can imagine it takes an army to raise a child with disabilities.
Most certainly it does.
So, on the converse of that, we sometimes learn from our heartbreak and when things don't go our way. Can you think of a moment or a case or a child where things did not pan out the way that you wanted them to? And what did that teach you?
So the first case I lost, I shouldn't have lost. To this day, I think I shouldn't have lost. I think we had an extremely meritorious case, but the judge didn't see it that way. What wound up happening in that case was we appealed and we appealed again, and we ultimately got some relief, not all of the relief that we were looking for, but we did get some relief. And we were able to creatively use that relief to start to create the basis, the legal record for another case. And ultimately, we were able, a few school years later, to be successful in bringing a case that was probably equally as meritorious as the first, but that was ultimately successful. What the overall case taught me was you never know what you're going to get. The best laid plans can always go awry. There are no assumptions, there are no expectations that even when you fall, you have to pick yourself back up. And oftentimes, when you do, you will emerge even stronger and potentially more successful than when before you fell in the first place.
a parting word, what would you tell a family that has a child with a disability who may be feeling frustrated, dejected, and heartbroken? Like, I'm not a parent. I'm not a parent yet, but I just know from personal experience with people that I know that it's exhausting. Parenting is exhausting. And when you have a child with a disability, and if it's a complex one, you feel like you're fighting a never ending battle. And it's just every day can exhaust you. What piece of advice do you have for parents that find themselves lost?
I think that parents who are feeling lost within the process need to take a moment to realize just how far they've come and to maybe remove themselves from that feeling of frustration or that feeling of being overwhelmed and give themselves the opportunity to see just how far they probably have come and that this journey is a long one. It is a long one for every single family. And the more needs that present themselves, the more challenging that journey can become. But we're never going to get to the end of our journey, or we're never going to make it further on our journey without taking things step by step. We can only be as good as we can be on any given day. My best day today might not be my best day tomorrow. We're human. We have to be kind to ourselves. We have to be patient with ourselves as well as with our loved ones. And we have to do the best that we can do. I think that informing yourself is a great way to gain confidence and to gain perspective. It information in and of itself provides you with the ability to know what's right or what's wrong, or what sounds right or what sounds wrong, or what path you might be able to take, or what path doesn't sound like the right fit for your family. The more you know, the better off you are going to be. You spoke about a village. Everybody's family looks different. Everybody's family dynamic looks different. Everybody's group, support network looks different. But there is always a network that is out there, whether it be in your family, whether it be friends, whether it be people in the community, whether it be within your own school district. There are support groups that are out there. There are, other ways in which, if you feel like you need additional support, there are options out there. And so there are times where things can feel dark and they can feel lonely or overwhelming. And we just have to make it to the next step. And from thereafter, we just have to make it to the next step.
As always, I want to thank my guest, Maria McGinley, for her time, expertise, and the value of her experiences. There are quite a few takeaways from this episode, mainly the importance of educating yourself as a parent, asking questions, and advocating for your child. Also, and this is in no way influenced by my profession, but yes, the value of a good attorney to help you navigate those long roads and tough times. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Aging Wisely, the podcast. As always, I would like to acknowledge Adam Galchis and his family band, The Waffles, for my theme music. And this week, I'd like to thank myself for the sound design and engineering. I've been super busy with back-to-back episodes, so I needed to take matters into my own hands. If you like my podcast, please subscribe or follow. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, SoundCloud, Pandora, or if you spend time on YouTube, the podcast has a channel by the same name where you can listen to the episodes. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, you can go to agingwiselypodcast.com, look around, listen to this and other episodes, and even better, subscribe to my newsletter. Every 2 weeks, the most recent episodes and the transcripts to the current episode straight into your inbox. And if you like this episode, I would love a review on your favorite platform. Believe it or not, reviews can help spread a podcast's message. And if you believe in my podcast, please help me spread mine. If you enjoy the podcast or have benefited from it in any way, please let others know about it. Join me in another 2 weeks for the next episode. Bye.